Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about life and happiness and what is the proper way to think about the two and integrate them together. This comes after a lot of thinking on this topic and a 4-hour discussion with Puya where we talk about this for like 2 hours of the time. It was a very exhausting conversation, but at the end I think we came to some pretty important integrations after listening to some Greg Salamieri and other stuff like that. But today, I just had a passion for writing about this topic. I was listening to the beginning of the Puya Reka conversation. I think I'm about an hour, 30 minutes in, and I felt like I should just get some stuff on paper, and that's what I decided to do. I basically wrote out my concept of how man forms his initial values, how happiness relates to that, how life relates to that, and basically how all of this integrates together. So this is the foundation. These are the foundations of the objectivist ethics. This is prior to man deciding that he should live, that he ought to live. This is like the basis of ethics. This is maybe even underneath ethics. I don't know if you'd even consider it part of ethics, because the objectivist ethics, a lot of it is about what should man do after he has decided to live from this fundamental alternative of life or death. But yeah, I just wrote this like a few minutes ago, unedited. Maybe there'll be grammatical errors. I doubt it. I'm usually pretty decent about grammar on rough drafts, but it's not like something edited. So maybe there'll be something incorrect in here, but you guys will feel free to correct me on that in when this video gets uploaded. Not so on the 28th, which is a Saturday, I believe. So this Saturday when this gets uploaded. So feel free to correct me on this. This is an important video and something I've spent a great deal of time thinking about and writing about as well. So let's begin. Let's begin with the very beginning. Man is born a blank slate with no preconceived ideas, with no innate ideas, with no innate values. As a child, he associates certain things with pleasure. These things become his values, these things which he wants to act to gain or keep in the future. He associates certain things with pleasure, so he wants to act to gain and keep them because they're pleasureful, because they bring pleasure, because they feel good. So these become his values. He then discovers the need to choose whether to live or die as he becomes an adult when he grows up. He discovers that he has to choose whether to act and live or die. This is the fundamental alternative that Rand speaks about. If you act, you live. If you act to pursue life-sustaining values, you live. If you don't do that, if you act to pursue values that don't sustain your life, then you're going to die. And if you don't act at all, you're also going to die. So, if he holds strong values, he'll end up choosing to live because he sees that he can only obtain his values if he's alive. You can't die and then still obtain your values. If you see that you have certain values that bring you pleasure, you're going to want to act. You're going to want to live. You're going to want to continue your life to continue to obtain these values. So at this point, he has to filter his values through the standard of life. He sees that certain values that he holds are consistent with his life, and other ones that he formed when he was a child because of the pleasure that they give him. This pleasure is going to lead him to die. If he continuously pursues this pleasure, he's going to end up dying quicker, or it's not immediate. It's not immediate when he achieves this value. He's going to die immediately, but he'll live a life of lack of focus, or he's not going to live a happy life, or he's going to die. Basically, that's the inevitable result. It's going to lead him to a quicker death. That's essentially what happens. So he filters them through the standard of life. The values that remain are those values that were formed on the basis of his pleasure pain mechanism that are consistent with his life. That's basically a restatement of what I've said before. In summary, his values are the things that bring him pleasure that are consistent with his life. So I'm basically just repeating the same thing because this is really important. It's interesting that I repeat the same thing, but probably in an edited copy I probably would cut that out, and that's an important principle of writing that I think Peikoff talks about. You don't want to be too redundant in your writing. Now, it is a fact that pleasure points to things in general, pleasure points to things that are consistent with life. Like in general, something that is pleasurable will generally be consistent with your life. This is not a super important principle for the argument I'm trying to make here, but it's a general principle that you should keep in mind. This is the reason why we have a pleasure-pain mechanism. So generally, if you form values at a young age, you're generally going to have some values that are consistent with your life, because that pleasure will generally be consistent with your life. So it's not like when you're super young, you're going to form a bunch of values based on the pleasure-pain mechanism, but every single one of them is going to lead you to death. You're going to have some values to pick from that are consistent with your life. But however, pleasure does not necessarily point to values that are consistent with your life. Because of this, we ought to make a distinction between those things that cause pleasure and lead to death, and those things that cause pleasure and lead to life. Yeah, that's an important distinction to make. Certain values that you form, all of them cause pleasure. All the values that you form as a child are things that cause pleasure because they're formed based on your pleasure-pain mechanism. So all of those values that you form bring pleasure, but certain ones will lead to your life. Certain ones lead to your death. So this is an important distinction to make, and this is what filtering it through life does. That's ultimately what filtering it through life does. It makes a distinction between these two types of values, tells you to cut away those values that lead to your death and keep those values that lead to your life. So both of these things are formed as values in a person during his childhood. However, one is this empty pleasure that ultimately leads to death. And it ultimately will lead to a fundamental desire to die as well. It'll lead you to wanting to die. It will lead you not to want to live, because if what brings pleasure is dying, if what brings pleasure is things that lead to your death, like let's say, I don't know. A lot of common things that people talk about with empty pleasure would be like snorting cocaine. So let's say you formed some value for snorting cocaine. I don't know how specifically you would do that. That's a question for psychology. But let's say you form that value. You would ultimately want to die because this act of snorting cocaine is what brings you pleasure. It's what you value. It's not an objective value, of course, and it'll lead you to death. So you will ultimately have this desire to engage in that pleasurable activity and die after that, because you don't want to pursue values that lead to your life. Now the other type of value that cause pleasure and lead to life is the non-contradictory joy that we define as happiness. Non-contradictory because it doesn't contradict your life, and joy because it's pleasure. This is what happiness is. This is the fundamental of how we define happiness as objectivists. So values that are consistent with life necessarily have this property of bringing happiness, because if you form this value, that means it's pleasurable, and if it is consistent with your life, then this pleasure is happiness. If your values are consistent with life aren't consistent with so if this wasn't true, basically if it's not true that values that are consistent with life necessarily, or yeah, let me start from what I said before, because I can't get back into this train of thought of this writing right now. Values that are consistent with life necessarily have this property of bringing happiness. Otherwise, they would never form, or they would lead to death. Basically, if they didn't lead to happiness based on the fact that happiness is a combination of pleasure and life, basically joy that's not contradictory. So if it didn't bring joy, you would never form those values to begin with. And if it was contradictory to life, then it would lead to death. So values that are consistent with life necessarily lead to happiness. This is why Rand argues that happiness is man's only moral purpose. This is a quote that Peikoff put in Opar from Rand, and I think it originally comes from Atlas Shrugged, looking at the bibliography. It is what causes us to form life-sustaining values to begin with. Happiness causes us to form life-sustaining values. That's the cause. That's the reason why life-sustaining values get formed, because of the happiness that they bring. Now, what we see it originally as pleasure, but eventually we discover that that's happiness by looking at seeing that it's consistent with life. However, this is an important thing to remember, keep in mind as well. Happiness makes no sense apart from life as the standard. Life comes first. You need to think about life first, essentially. You can't disconnect the two, of course, because they're very much connected. They're necessarily integrated. But life comes first. You have to, in your own life, you have to discover life first, and then you look at your values through this filter of life, and you discover that, and then you discover happiness by seeing that certain values lead to your life, lead to the sustainment of your life. So happiness, as I mentioned, is the pleasure that comes from values that are consistent with life, and is the pleasure that led to said life-sustaining values to being formed in the first place. Hence, life is the criteria by which we determine whether or not pleasure derived from the achievement of value is happiness. Life is the criteria by which, I'm going to repeat this. Life is the criteria by which we determine whether or not the pleasure derived from the achievement of a value is happiness. That's basically how we decide that our value, that the pleasure that comes from our values leads us to be happy. And is ultimately the criteria by which we judge whether or not to pursue a certain value. So yeah, that's how we should decide that. However, before one decides to live, he must first have formed values. He must first, if you're going to act, you have to have values to act, to gain or keep. You have to have formed those values in your childhood. If these values bring him happiness, pleasure that's consistent with life, he's going to choose to live, and he ought to follow the objectivist ethics, because the objectivist ethics basically tells you that you should live and pursue the values that are consistent with your life. So if the values that you formed are consistent with your life, meaning that these values bring happiness, then you ought to follow them. You ought to be an objectivist as well. You ought to choose to live. But if your values bring you the empty pleasure that I spoke about before, if his values bring him the empty pleasure that I spoke about before, he will live a life in pursuit of death. He will pursue a second of pleasure that will kill him the next second. And if he never forms values, he will never act, and he will eventually die. So this is basically how I integrate life and happiness. Life and happiness this is an important integration, and it lies at the foundation of the objectivist ethics. Rand basically explains that life is the standard. Life is how we determine whether or not we should pursue a specific value. And happiness is the reward for achieving these values. Happiness is what you gain when you achieve these values. And it ultimately is how these values form in the first place. Values are either formed based on actual happiness versus empty pleasure. Now, the empty pleasure values you throw away. That's what when you decide that you want to live. When you decide you want to live, you throw away the empty pleasure values. And then the majority of your values, because as I explained, the majority of your values will be all your values are going to be formed off of pleasure, and generally pleasure is something that is life-sustaining. So that means the majority of your values will end up being consistent with your life, and they will end up bringing happiness. So ultimately, then you choose to follow these you choose to pursue these values, and ultimately gain the reward of happiness throughout your life. But the standard by which you choose to act on these values, this is how you decide whether or not you want to act on these values, is life. That is the standard here. That's the primary. That's how you decide how you should act in general. However, the purpose of life, the purpose of wanting to act at all, the reason why you have values at all, the purpose of life, basically the purpose of morality, as Rand has said, man's only moral purpose is happiness. That is why you form these values to begin with. That's why you form life-sustaining values to begin with. That's why you end up having values to begin with, because of happiness, because there's this objective potential for happiness in life. And that's extremely important here. That's extremely important, because if there wasn't that potential for happiness in life, all the values that you would form would be empty pleasure. And you would ultimately, if you wanted to act, you would only be able to pursue values inconsistent with your life, and you would die. Or you wouldn't form values at all, and then you would die. So both instances would lead to your death. You would have no reason to live. So fundamentally, happiness is the existence of happiness. The potential for happiness is the reason why we end up living. And that is fundamentally why Rand calls it man's moral purpose. And this is very important. It's very, very difficult. It's very difficult to grasp and very difficult to talk about. And I'm sure Puya might have some disagreements with this video. He might not. I think we have a similar perspective. I just place a lot more emphasis on happiness than he does. Yeah, I think that might be a good summary. I love Puya. Puya's a great guy, and honestly, I don't feel like we have as many differences as he thinks we do. Maybe we do. I don't know. But yeah, I think I laid out my case. So go ahead in the comments and leave your response. And tell me if I'm getting something wrong. Tell me if I'm misunderstanding Rand's ethics, or the basis of Rand's ethics, because this is important. This is how we justify living in general. This is how we decide whether or not we want to live, and how we ultimately fundamentally decide whether or not ethics is actually valuable to us. Because Rand's ethics presupposes that we choose to live, and that we have values that are worth pursuing, that we have values that lead to happiness. And that's something you have to discover for yourself, obviously, inductively, and I'm pretty sure everybody has values worth pursuing in life, and so you should definitely choose to live. That is definitely the case, because I do think there's an objective potential for happiness in all of our lives. And when I say the objective potential for happiness, I mean that there is pleasure that exists. There are values that you can obtain that are consistent with your life. That's what I mean when I say there is an objective potential for happiness. I mean that there are values that you can pursue that will lead to pleasure and life, which is happiness. So yeah, go out there, pursue happiness, and live. And remember that the two are completely integrated. The two are one and the same. You can't separate the two. Don't separate the two. Always keep happiness connected to life. That is very important here. It's one of the most complicated things about Rand's ethics is understanding this principle, and I might not even understand it fully, and I feel like that's what a lot of the more complicated objectivist ethics stuff talks about. We looked at some Greg Salamieri video, me and Puya did in our video, and at the point he was like, I'm not sure I have the best formulation of this, and that's the sort of thing that we're arguing about right now, which is interesting, because we're doing some really important work, I guess, with philosophy and ethics. I feel like this is very important stuff. This is stuff that the objectivist ethics didn't cover super in depth. They kind of touched on a little bit, but didn't go in depth very much. And I think there's a lot to be said there, because I view happiness as extremely important, and I think that's something that I would like to touch on quite a bit on my channel and in general. I've talked about happiness quite a bit on my channel as well in the past. But yeah, hopefully you got something out of this video, and tell me if I'm getting Rand's ethics wrong. Please do. And if you think I am, and you have a better argument to tell me, come on my channel. If that's what Puya did, he basically I had a disagreement with him, and I brought it up to him, and then we had our discussion. I brought it up in the discussion. I probably should have given him some warning about it so that he could have come prepared, but he did a good job. He explained his position very well and changed my mind on a few things. Not necessarily changed it, helped me integrate my perspective better with his. But yeah, I think that is all I have to say for today. This is a long and complex video, so now that you're done watching this video, go take a hot shower and relax. Play some music, go chill in your room, and close your eyes and think about how beautiful life is. So yeah, that's all I have to say for today. Thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next video. Peace.